Sometimes the smallest kindness happens when no one is watching, but it's the one that changes everything. The rain had been falling for hours, steady and cold, the kind that soaked through fabric and settled into your bones, and inside the dim glow of a roadside diner just off Highway 9, Emily Carter moved quietly between tables, her sneakers squeaking softly against the worn tile floor as she carried a half-empty coffee pot in one hand and a tired smile on her face. The late shift always like this, slow and heavy, the hum of neon lights buzzing overhead while truckers and night workers lingered over their meals, stretching time before heading back out into the dark, and Emily, 26, exhausted but composed, tied her apron a little tighter as she wiped down the counter, counting tips in her head, calculating rent, groceries, gas, everything measured, everything careful, because one wrong number could mean everything falling apart. And still, when the bell above the diner door rang, sharp against the quiet, she looked up the same way she always did, not with irritation, not with indifference, but with attention, because that was just who she was, and the man who stepped in didn't look like he belonged anywhere near a place like this. Not tonight, not in the shape he was in, his jacket soaked through, hair damp, shoes marked with mud like he'd been walking longer than anyone should in weather like this. And for a moment, no one moved, not the couple in the booth, not the cook behind the counter, just a pause, subtle but real, the kind of silence that comes when people decide, without saying it out loud, what someone is worth. And Emily saw it, the hesitation, the shift, the way eyes dropped and shoulders turned slightly away, and she didn't say anything, didn't react. She just reached for a clean towel and stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "Hey, you can come in out of the rain." And it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, just simple, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And the man looked at her, really looked like he hadn't expected to be seen at all, like he'd already prepared himself to be ignored, and she held that gaze for just a second longer than most people would, not out of curiosity, not out of pity, but something quieter, something steadier, recognition. And then she turned slightly, already reaching for a menu that she knew he might not even use, because sometimes it wasn't about what someone could order, it was about whether they were allowed to sit. And outside, the rain kept falling, tapping against the windows like a quiet reminder that the world didn't stop for anyone. But inside, in that small space between one moment and the next, something had already shifted, something no one else in the room would notice, not yet, because kindness like that rarely announces itself. It just happens quietly, without permission, without expectation, and Emily didn't know it. Not then, not as she guided him to a seat near the counter, not as she placed a glass of water in front of him before he even asked, not as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and moved on to her next table like it was just another part of her shift, just another ordinary moment in an ordinary life. But somewhere in that quiet decision, in that simple act of seeing someone when others chose not to, everything had already begun to change. Emily moved through the diner like nothing unusual had happened, but something lingered in the air, a quiet shift that only she seemed unaware of, as if the moment had settled somewhere deeper than the surface. And behind the counter, Rick, the night manager, watched her with a tightening jaw, his eyes flicking from the soaked man now seated at the far end to the register where every order was supposed to be accounted for, every dollar tracked, every rule followed, because this place did not run on kindness. It ran on margins, and margins were thin. And when Emily returned to the counter, reaching for a clean mug, Rick leaned in just enough for his voice to stay low. "You planning to charge him, or is this another one of your charity nights?" And she did not flinch, did not argue. She just poured coffee slowly, the dark liquid steaming as it filled the cup. "He will order when he is ready," she said, simple, steady, like the answer was already complete. And Rick exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That is not how this works, Emily, you know that." But she was already walking away, setting the mug down gently. In front of the man, her movements precise, calm, like she had done this 1,000 times before, and the man wrapped his hands around the cup, not drinking yet, just holding it, like warmth itself was something unfamiliar, something to be rediscovered. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the sound of rain filling the space between them, tapping softly against the glass. And then, Quietly, he said, "I do not have anything on me," his voice even, but there was something beneath it, not embarrassment, not quite, something closer to testing, like he was watching for her reaction the same way others had watched him when he walked in, waiting to see where he would be placed, and Emily met his eyes again, steady, unhurried. "That is okay," she said, and it was not hesitation, it was not negotiation, it was certainty, and she reached for her order pad, scribbling something down before tearing the page and setting it beside the cup, the ink still fresh, and when he glanced down, he saw it, a receipt, simple, printed, but where a total should have been, there was only one line written in pen, $0.00, and beneath it, just 3 words, written small but clear, "Take your time," and something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptible, but real, like a calculation had been interrupted, like a pattern he expected had been broken, and across the room, Rick saw it too, the slip of paper, the absence of a charge, and he stepped forward, faster this time. His voice no longer quiet. "Emily, we are not running a shelter here," and a few heads turned, the room pulling slightly toward the tension, but Emily did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself. She simply turned, meeting Rick's frustration with the same calm she had offered the stranger. "He is not asking for anything more than a seat and a cup of coffee," she said, and for a second, it felt like the room held its breath, like something unseen was being measured, not in dollars, not in policy, but in something harder to define, and Rick hesitated, just long enough to realize that pushing further would make him look smaller than the situation already had, so he stepped back with a muttered warning, something about consequences, something about rules, but the moment had already passed, and when Emily turned back, the man was still looking at the receipt, still holding that small piece of paper like it meant more than it should, and finally, he spoke again, softer this time. "You might regret this," and Emily gave a slight shake of her head, a quiet certainty in her voice. "No," she said, "I would regret not doing it." And outside, the rain kept falling, but inside, something unspoken had begun to take shape, something neither of them fully understood yet. But both of them felt, in the silence that followed. The man did not touch the coffee right away, not because he did not need it, but because something else had caught his attention, something smaller, quieter, the kind of thing most people would miss, the way Emily moved through the diner without looking back at him for approval, without checking if he was grateful, without adjusting her behavior after Rick's warning, as if what she had done required no validation at all. And that unsettled him more than anything else that had happened that night, because in his world, everything had a reaction. Every action calculated, every favor tracked, every kindness expected to return something greater. But here, in this small place with flickering lights and worn booths, none of those rules seemed to apply, and he finally lifted the cup, taking a slow sip, the warmth spreading through him in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, not just physical, but something deeper, something quieter, and his eyes followed her again as she stopped at another table, kneeling slightly to speak to an elderly couple, her voice soft, her smile real, not forced, not rehearsed, and it was clear that she treated everyone the same, not based on what they could give her, but simply because they were there, and he leaned back slightly, studying the room with a different lens now, noticing details he would have ignored before, the chipped edge of the counter, the handwritten specials board, the way the clock above the door ticked just a fraction too loud in the silence between conversations, and then his gaze returned to the receipt still resting beside his cup, $0.00, the ink slightly smudged where it had not fully dried, and he picked it up carefully, almost like it mattered more than it should, turning it over. Once, then back again, as if expecting to find something hidden there, some condition, some expectation, but there was nothing, just those 3 words, simple and final, and for a moment, he closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly, as if something inside him was recalibrating, something long set in place beginning to shift, and when he opened them again, Emily was walking back toward him, not with urgency, not with curiosity, just routine, her order pad tucked under her arm. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked, her tone the same as before, steady, unassuming, and he hesitated, not because of the question, but because of the answer forming in his mind, because this time it was not about the food, it was about what accepting it would mean, about stepping into a moment where he was no longer in control of the exchange, and he looked at her for a second longer than necessary, searching for something, any sign that this was a performance, that there was something behind it, but there was only calm, only patience, and finally, he nodded once. "What do you recommend?" he asked, and she smiled slightly, not wide, not exaggerated, just enough to soften the moment. "The grilled cheese is good," she said. "It is simple, but it is warm." And he almost laughed at that, not out loud, but internally, because it sounded like more than just a description of food. And she wrote it down without waiting for confirmation, as if she already knew he would accept, and as she turned to place the order, he spoke again, quieter this time. "Emily," he said, reading her name from the tag pinned neatly to her uniform, and she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Yes," and he held the receipt up slightly, just enough for her to see. "You do this often?" And she considered the question for a moment, not rushing, not deflecting, then gave a small shake of her head. "Not often," she said. "Just when it feels right." And that answer lingered long after she walked away, settling into the space between who he had been before he walked through that door and who he was beginning to realize he might have become without even noticing. And outside, the rain began to slow, the steady rhythm softening into something lighter, almost like the storm itself was losing its grip, but inside, something else was only just beginning. The grilled cheese arrived a few minutes later, golden and crisp at the edges, the kind of simple meal that carried more comfort than it should, and Emily placed it in front of him without ceremony, just a quiet nod before she turned to leave. But he stopped her again, not with urgency, not with authority, just a slight shift in his voice that carried something unfamiliar. "You are not curious," he said, and she paused, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, her posture relaxed. "About what?" she asked, and he glanced down at himself. The damp jacket, the worn look, the version of him the world had already decided on within seconds of seeing him walk through that door. "About who I am," he replied, and there it was, the question that had followed him his entire life. Sometimes spoken, often implied, always expected, and Emily tilted her head slightly, considering him not as a category, not as a status, but as a person sitting in front of her. "No," she said simply, and the answer landed heavier than he anticipated, not dismissive, not careless, just honest. "Why not?" he asked, and she gave a small shrug, almost apologetic. "Because it would not change what you need right now," she said, and then she was gone again, moving back into the rhythm of the diner, leaving him alone with a sentence that felt far more significant than it should have been, and he looked down at the sandwich, at the melted cheese stretching slightly as he pulled it apart, and for the first time in a long time, he ate without distraction, without checking a phone, without thinking 3 steps ahead, just present, just there, and across the room, Rick watched with narrowed eyes, still unsettled, still calculating what this meant for his rules, his control, but even he could not deny that something about the moment had shifted beyond his reach, and time moved quietly, the clock above the door ticking forward, the rain outside softening into a mist that blurred the world just enough to make everything feel suspended, and when the plate was empty, the man sat back, his hands resting on the table, his gaze drifting once more to the receipt, then to Emily, who was now refilling a coffee for another customer, laughing softly at something they said, and he stood slowly, reaching into his jacket as if out of habit, then stopping halfway, remembering, and instead, he placed the receipt neatly on the table, smoothing it once with his fingers, like it deserved to be left untouched, and when Emily returned, he was already near the door, the bell above it still, waiting. "Thank you," he said, and the words were simple, but there was something behind them, something quieter, something real, and she nodded, the same calm expression, the same steady presence. "Take care," she replied, and for a moment, neither of them moved, like the space between them held something unfinished, something that did not need to be spoken yet, and then he stepped outside, the cool air meeting him, the rain now reduced to a light drizzle that barely touched the ground before fading, and he paused just beyond the door, looking back once, not at the diner, not at the room, but at her, the way she continued, moving, unchanged, unaffected by the weight of what had just happened, as if to her, it truly was just another moment, just another person, and that realization stayed with him longer than anything else, because in a world where everything had a price, where everything was measured and negotiated, she had offered something without asking anything in return, and he stood there for a second longer than necessary, as if committing the moment to memory, before turning and walking into the night. The faint sound of the door closing behind him marking the end of something small, and the beginning of something neither of them could yet see. The door had barely settled back into place when the diner seemed to exhale, the quiet returning in slow layers as if nothing significant had just occurred, but for Emily, something lingered in the back of her mind. Not loud, not distracting, just a faint echo of that final look he gave before stepping out into the night, and she brushed it aside the same way she always did, because thinking too much about moments like that did not pay bills, did not change the fact that her shift still had 2 hours left, and so she moved, wiping tables, refilling cups, resetting napkin holders with practiced precision, each motion grounded, controlled, like a rhythm she had learned to rely on when everything else felt uncertain. And behind the counter, Rick was quieter now, but not calmer, his silence sharper than before, his eyes following her movements with a kind of restrained frustration. And when the last customer paid and left, the neon sign outside flickering slightly as the rain finally stopped completely, he stepped forward, arms crossed, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk," and Emily nodded once, already knowing what was coming, not because she feared it, but because she understood the rules of places like this, the unspoken lines that were not meant to be crossed, and she leaned lightly against the counter, her hands still, waiting. "You cannot just give things away," Rick continued, his tone measured, like he was trying to keep control of something that had already slipped. "That is not your call to make," and she listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. And when he finished, she spoke just as calmly. "It was 1 meal," she said, and he shook his head immediately. "It is never just one, Emily. It sets a precedent, people see that and they expect more," and she held his gaze, not challenging, not defensive, just present. "He did not expect anything," she replied, and that was what unsettled him the most, not the action itself, but the way she refused to frame it as a mistake, as something that needed correction. And Rick exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Look, you are a good worker, you are reliable, but this place cannot afford that kind of risk." And there it was, the line drawn clearly now, the balance between what was right and what was allowed, and Emily straightened slightly, not tense, not upset, just aware. "I understand," she said, and for a moment, Rick hesitated, as if expecting resistance, an argument, something he could respond to, but there was none, only acceptance, and that made the decision easier for him, or at least easier to justify. "Then you also understand that I cannot ignore it," he said, and she nodded once more, a small, quiet motion that carried more weight than words, and without another sentence, she untied her apron, folding it carefully instead of dropping it, placing it neatly on the counter as if it still mattered, as if the role she had just stepped out of deserved respect. And the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been, because there was no anger, no pleading, just a quiet end to something that had been holding her together piece by piece. And she reached for her jacket, slipping it on slowly, her movements unhurried, controlled, the same way she had carried herself all night. And as she walked toward the door, Rick spoke again, softer this time, almost uncertain. "You could have just followed the rules." And Emily paused with her hand on the handle, not turning around, just listening, and after a second, she answered, her voice steady, almost gentle, "I did what felt right." And then she stepped outside, the air cool and clean after the rain, the world quieter than before, and for a moment, she stood there under the dim streetlight, alone, without a shift to return to, without a plan for what came next, but not shaken, not broken, just still, as if she had traded something uncertain for something she understood more clearly. And in that quiet space, with the night stretching out ahead of her, she did not look back. The night air carried a quiet stillness that felt almost unfamiliar, the kind that settled in after something had ended but before anything new had begun, and Emily pulled her jacket closer around her as she started walking down the dim stretch of road, the diner's flickering neon sign fading behind her with each step, her shoes tapping softly against the pavement still damp from the rain, and she did not rush, did not reach for her phone, did not try to fill the silence, because this was not the first time she had stood at the edge of uncertainty, and she had learned that panic did not solve anything, it only made the moment heavier than it already was, and so she walked, steady and calm, the cool air brushing against her face as her thoughts moved quietly in the background, not racing, not spiraling, just acknowledging what had happened, the lost shift, the missed income, the questions waiting for her in the morning. And yet beneath all of that, there was no regret, not even a flicker, just a quiet acceptance that some choices were not meant to be calculated, they were meant to be lived with, and a few blocks away, the sound of tires rolling slowly over wet asphalt broke the silence, a black sedan moving through the empty street with a smooth, controlled presence that stood out against the stillness of everything else, and inside, the man who had sat at the counter earlier watched through the tinted window, his gaze fixed not on the road ahead, but on the figure walking alone under the streetlights, her posture unchanged, her pace even, as if the world had not just taken something from her. And for a moment, he said nothing, his hand resting lightly against the armrest, his expression unreadable but thoughtful, and in the front seat, the driver glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, sensing the shift in attention. "Sir," he said carefully, but the man did not respond right away, his focus still on her. The memory of that receipt, that simple line of ink, replaying in his mind with a clarity that refused to fade, and finally, he spoke. His voice quiet but certain, "Slow down," and the car eased its speed, rolling almost silently alongside the sidewalk, keeping distance, not intruding, just observing, and Emily did not notice at first, her attention on the ground ahead, her thoughts steady, until the faint hum of the engine lingered a little too long beside her, and she glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized the silhouette through the glass, and the car came to a smooth stop a few feet ahead, the rear door opening without a sound. And for a brief moment, neither of them moved, the space between them holding something unspoken, something unfinished from earlier. And then he stepped out, no longer hidden behind the version of himself the world had assumed, his posture straight, his presence composed, but his expression different now, less guarded, less distant, and Emily watched him, not surprised, not impressed, just attentive, as if she was seeing him for the first time in a different light. And he walked toward her slowly, stopping just close enough to be heard without raising his voice. "You lost your job because of me," he said, not as a question, not as an apology, just a statement of fact, and she held his gaze, steady as always. "No," she replied, "I made a choice," and the words settled between them, simple but firm, and for a second, the world around them seemed to quiet even further, as if the night itself was waiting to see what would come next, because something had shifted, something undeniable, and neither of them could walk away from it the same way they had before. The space between them held steady, not tense, not fragile, just real, like two people standing at the edge of something neither of them had planned, and Daniel studied her for a moment longer, not as someone above her, not as someone evaluating, but as someone trying to understand something that did not fit into the patterns he had spent years building. "Most people would have asked for something by now," he said quietly, the words more observation than accusation, and Emily shifted her weight slightly, her hands resting inside the pockets of her jacket, her expression unchanged. "Most people are not me," she replied, and there was no pride in it, no edge, just a simple truth stated without decoration, and for the first time, a faint hint of something softer crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like one, and he glanced briefly back at the car, the driver waiting without movement, then returned his attention to her. "Let me fix this," he said, the sentence coming out naturally, almost automatically, the way he had handled problems his entire life, with solutions, with control, with the ability to replace what had been lost with something better, something larger, something undeniable. But Emily shook her head before he could continue, not abruptly, not dismissively, just enough to stop the direction of the moment from shifting into something it was never meant to be. "You cannot fix something that was not broken," she said, and that stopped him completely, because it was not resistance he was used to, it was clarity, and he took a small breath, adjusting slightly. "You lost income, stability, your routine," he continued, trying to frame it in a way that made sense. "That matters." And she nodded once, acknowledging the facts without denying them. "It does," she agreed, "but it does not change what I chose." And again, there it was, that same quiet certainty that did not bend under pressure, that did not shift when something more powerful stood in front of it. And Daniel looked at her differently now, not as someone who needed help, but as someone who had something he could not replicate, something he could not buy. And for a moment, the night felt still again, like it had earlier. But this time, the silence carried a different weight, less uncertain, more deliberate. And he reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out a card, not flashy, not exaggerated, just clean and simple, his name printed in understated lettering, and he held it out to her, not pushing it forward, not insisting, just offering it as a possibility. "If you change your mind," he said, his voice steady, "call me." And she looked at the card but did not take it right away, her eyes lifting back to his, searching not for the name, not for the status behind it, but for the intention. And after a second, she accepted it, sliding it into her pocket without looking down again, not impressed, not overwhelmed, just acknowledging the gesture for what it was. And he nodded slightly, something in his posture easing, as if the moment had reached a natural point of pause, not an ending, but not a beginning either, something in between. And as he stepped back, turning toward the car, he hesitated just once, glancing over his shoulder. "Emily," he said, and she met his gaze again, calm as ever. "Yes," and he held that look for a fraction longer, something unspoken passing between them, something that did not need to be defined yet. "You were right," he said quietly, "someone should." And then he got into the car, the door closing softly behind him, the engine barely audible as it pulled away, leaving her standing under the streetlight once more. But this time, the night did not feel as uncertain as before, because something had been set in motion, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the same way everything else had begun, quietly, without expectation. And somewhere in that silence, the future had already started to take shape. The street grew quieter as the car disappeared into the distance, its presence fading as smoothly as it had arrived. And Emily stood there for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the pocket where the card now sat, not heavy, not significant in weight, but noticeable in a way she could not ignore. And she did not take it out, did not look at it again, because what mattered had already happened. Not in the name printed on it, not in whatever it represented, but in the choice she had made before any of that existed. And with a small breath, she turned and continued walking, the rhythm of her step steady against the pavement, the night air settling around her like a quiet companion. And by the time she reached her apartment, a modest building tucked between a closed laundromat and a dimly lit convenience store, the world had returned to something familiar, something manageable, and she let herself inside. The soft click of the door closing behind her marking the end of a day that had shifted more than she could fully process. And inside, everything was simple. A small space with a worn couch, a narrow kitchen, a single lamp casting a warm, steady light, and she moved through it the same way she had moved through the diner, with quiet intention, setting her jacket aside, placing her keys in the same spot they always went, grounding herself in routine even as the memory of the night lingered just beneath the surface. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to sit, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze unfocused, replaying fragments of the evening not as something dramatic, but as something quietly important. The look in his eyes, the way the receipt had felt when she wrote it, the moment she stepped out of the diner without looking back. And then, slowly, she reached into her pocket, pulling out the card at last, turning it between her fingers, the clean edges catching the light, and she read the name once, Daniel Hayes, simple, direct, and beneath it, a title that explained everything without needing to say much at all, and she let out a small breath, not surprise, not disbelief, just confirmation of something she had already sensed in a way she could not quite explain, and she set the card down on the table, not treating it as something fragile, not elevating it beyond what it was, just placing it there like any other object, and across the city, in a building that rose far above the quiet streets she walked every day, Daniel stood by a window overlooking a skyline that stretched endlessly, the lights reflecting in the glass as he loosened his tie slightly, his posture still composed but his thoughts elsewhere, and behind him, a voice broke the silence, measured, professional. The board meeting is scheduled for 8 in the morning, and he nodded once without turning, his attention still on the reflection of the city, but what he saw was not numbers, not deals, not the next decision waiting to be made. It was a small diner, a quiet moment, a handwritten receipt with no total, and a woman who had looked at him without asking what he was worth, and after a second, he spoke, his voice calm but different in a way his assistant had never heard before. "Cancel my morning," he said, and there was a pause behind him, subtle but present. "Sir, the investors are flying in from..." "Reschedule it," he replied, not raising his voice, not explaining further, just setting a new direction with the same certainty he had used to build everything he had. But this time, the reason was not strategy, not profit. It was something else, something quieter. And as the room fell silent again, he reached into his pocket, pulling out nothing, because there was nothing left to hold. The receipt still in the diner, the moment already passed, and yet it stayed with him, clearer than anything else he had faced that day, because for the first time in a long time, something had not been measured, not been negotiated, and that was exactly why it mattered. Morning arrived without announcement, the light slipping quietly through the thin curtains of Emily's apartment as if it had no intention of interrupting anything, just continuing what the night had already set in motion, and she woke the same way she always did, without hesitation, without delay, her body already accustomed to early hours and long days, and for a moment, she lay still, not thinking about what had been lost, not calculating what needed to be replaced, just listening to the quiet hum of the city waking up beyond her window, and then she sat up, her gaze drifting naturally to the small table where the card still rested exactly where she had left it, untouched, unexamined beyond that first glance, and she did not reach for it, not immediately, because she understood something that most people did not, that what mattered was not what it could offer, but what it represented, a choice, not a rescue. And across the city, the building that carried Daniel Hayes's name stood tall against the skyline, its glass reflecting the early light in sharp, clean lines, and inside, a conference room filled slowly with executives, each one prepared, each one expecting the usual precision, the usual control, the usual man who never stepped away from a decision once it had been set, and yet, the head chair remained empty, the silence stretching longer than anyone was comfortable with, until the door finally opened, and Daniel entered not rushed, not apologetic, just present, his posture calm, his expression unreadable, and he took his seat without ceremony, glancing once around the room before speaking, his voice steady. "We are going to make a change," and there was no build-up, no explanation yet, just a statement that shifted the air immediately, and one of the executives leaned forward slightly, confusion clear but controlled. "Regarding which division?" he asked, and Daniel paused, just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle. "All of them," he replied, and the room stilled, not because they did not understand the words, but because they had never heard him say something without attaching numbers, projections, outcomes, and for the first time, he did not reach for a presentation, did not refer to data, he simply spoke. "We have spent years measuring value in one way," he continued, his gaze steady, "and we have been wrong." And across the table, eyes shifted, not in disagreement, but in uncertainty, because this was not the language of business. This was something else, something unfamiliar, and he leaned back slightly, his tone unchanged. "Effective immediately, we will be restructuring our hiring and training programs, not just for performance, but for character, for judgment, for how people treat others when there is nothing to gain, and no one interrupted, no one questioned, because something in the way he said it made it clear that this was not a discussion, it was a decision. And miles away, in a small apartment that did not appear on any map of influence or power, Emily stood by the table at last, picking up the card with quiet intention, her fingers tracing the edge once before she slipped it into her bag, not as a lifeline, not as a necessity, but as a possibility she chose to acknowledge on her own terms. And when she stepped outside, the air felt different than it had the night before, not because the world had changed, but because something within it had, something subtle, something quiet, something that did not need to announce itself to be real. And somewhere between those two worlds, one built on control and one grounded in quiet strength, a single moment had already begun to ripple outward, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, because some changes do not arrive with force. They arrive with clarity, and they stay long after everything else has moved on. And in that space, without needing to be seen or measured, the truth remained simple and undeniable. She did not ask who he was. She showed who she was, and that was what changed everything.